Okay, well, I think we'll get started. Thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful turnout. I'd like to welcome you to, in the name of Oldie and César, to our final presentation within the forum series for this year. And so on behalf of Jeremy Sarah and myself, thank you all for having participated and in particular coming to today's session. As you know, the aim of the forum is to provide a platform for exchanging ideas between the University of Ottawa community of researchers interested in this area and international and national researchers and invited speakers and individuals who are interested in the same research. So I believe we've met our objective in doing that. We continue to do so within this space. We have had over the year a very interesting group of presentations, series of presentations. If by chance you missed one or more, you can always come visit our website, and all of the presentations have been recorded and are available through a link on our website. So if there's one that you unfortunately weren't able to attend, the presentation, the recording is there. And likewise for today, Kim's will be there. So if there's something you need to revisit, then of course you'll be able to go back and listen to Kim's presentation from today. Although you're here in person, so there's no need to return to it, unless of course you need to quote or whatever. At this time, I would just bring one detail to your attention. We do have another presentation that is somewhat under the umbrella of the Oldie Forum. However, it is being hosted by GRIGL. There's a test. Do you know what GRIGL stands for? Language Management Interdisciplinary Research Group, mais en français, c'est Groupe de Recherche Interdisciplinaire en Gestion de Langue. And this is the debate that is going to take place on April the 14th, in 2 weeks' time, in the Louis Pasteur Building, room 326. And it's a debate, what is so special about language? A political philosophy approach, by the debate between David Robichaud and Yael Peled. I'm sure I've not said that name right. However, if you'd like to have the exact information about this, please again visit our website and you'll have that information. So without any more time listening to me, I would like to introduce or ask Dr. Richard Clément, Director of Oldie and Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts, to present our speaker for today.
Thank you, Jennifer. So it is my pleasure and honor, I must say, to welcome Kim Noels today. Kim obtained her PhD here at the University of Ottawa 20 years ago in psychology, and has had quite a varied career since then. She's currently full professor at the University of Alberta in the Department of Psychology and in the area of social and cultural psychology. I mentioned her varied career. Well, she first started with a postdoc at the University of California in Santa Barbara, but in the Department of Communication. And she usually is in contact with communication scholars, social and cross-cultural psychologists, teachers, scholars oriented toward pedagogical issues, TESL Ontario, among others. She's a fellow of the International Academy of Intercultural Research and has won many, many awards. She also is the recipient of a SSHRC grant, a SSHRC 5-year grant to study identity issues among Chinese immigrants. So you can see the span of her interest here. Just to mention two papers she's written. In 2014, students' self-determined and integrative orientations and teachers' motivational support in the Japanese as a foreign language context. That's one of them. The other one is more serious, learning from authoritarian teachers. Controlling the situation or controlling yourself can sustain motivation. So with this, please welcome Kim Noels.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Merci Richard pour l'introduction, c'était très gracieuse. Alors, je vais présenter aujourd'hui en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions en français, alors s'il vous plaît, s'il vous plaît, les poser et je peux essayer de répondre en français. Today I'm going to be talking about the dynamics of self-determined motivation over the language course, which is a general enough title that I'm going to go a little beyond that, but I'm going to start off by talking about how it is that motivation changes over time. And to start off, I want to just talk a little bit about my take on motivation. And motivation is a very, very broad construct. And at one point, I think I love this quote, I show it often because Bob Gardner, who is like the father of motivation in second language research, at one point he said, how do we define motivation? Well, we all know what a motivated person is. It's somebody who's goal-directed, expends effort, is persistent, is attentive, has desires or wants, exhibits positive affect, is aroused, has expectancies, demonstrates self-confidence or self-efficacy, and has reasons or motives. So it's all these things into one, and we can't possibly study all of it in one research program. So my is focused on two aspects in particular. And the first part that I've been interested in is this idea of effort, persistence, and attention. And the reason for that is because effort, persistence, and attention are pretty consistently related to the kinds of outcomes that we're generally interested in when we're teaching people languages. So things like the kind of the persistence, whether they're going to continue learning the language, predicts how good they're going to become in the language, whether they're paying attention to what's going on, whether they're putting in effort into their homework. All these things are very closely tied to how good they eventually become, more or less pretty directly. And the other thing I've been really interested in are these reasons or motives that Gardner describes. And the reason for that is because I think some of these reasons might be good predictors of when we're going to put in effort and attention and persist at something. And so those two aspects are what I'm going to focus on today. Now, in my talk, I'm going to emphasize a couple of themes that have been very prominent in the literature on motivation and language learning in recent years. More and more people have developed a kind of interest in motivation that really focuses on the self and identity. And perhaps one of the most widely known paradigms for that is Zoltan Dernier's L2 motivational self system, his ideas about the ideal self. I'm not using that paradigm, self-determination theory, but they both put an emphasis on that the idea we are more motivated when things are important to ourselves. And the other theme that I'm going to highlight is the notion of motivational dynamics. So within applied linguistics and second language acquisition research, there's been a current of thought that wants to highlight the fact that we see language as a system or as a system of systems, and that we should be looking at what goes on in language learning more from a dynamic perspective as a system, but also as a changeable system that changes over time. So I'm going to be emphasizing that as well. And today's main points, though, when you walk away from here at the end of the day, I hope I can convince you that students' reasons or orientations reflect greater or lesser self-determination, and that more self-determination is related to more successful outcomes, but it's complex and dynamic. It's not straightforward. That we can promote self-determination by promoting students' feelings of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, but it's complex and dynamic. And that as teachers, we are likewise best motivated when we experience self-determination. So I want to step away from talking about students for a moment to talking about some recent research we've been doing with teachers. And if I have time at the end, I might talk about another research project, but we'll see how it goes. All right, so that first point, that students' reasons or orientations reflect greater or lesser self-determination. Oh, I hope it doesn't do this all the way through. So let's talk then about the reasons that people have for learning a language. Well, there's this great website at the Center for Language, Linguistics and Area Studies in the UK. I don't know if you've ever come across this, but they have listed on their website in this wonderful table that goes on pages and pages all sorts of reasons why people would want to learn a second language. 700 of them listed. Now, that's really exciting, but 700 is a lot for me to deal with. And so I've tried to find another framework to help me organize these ideas in a simpler way. And so I've turned to self-determination theory for help in this. Now, self-determination theory was developed by D.C. and Ryan and colleagues around the world. It's a very prominent theory of motivation in psychology. And basically, you'll be familiar with terms like intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And of course, amotivation is not having motivation. But it's a little trickier than just those broad categories. So one thing that's important to note is that the name of the title gives away something important, is that they see these kinds of motivations as being spread along a continuum of self-determination. That is a continuum of how much we personally get to decide what it is we're going to do, whether we're self-motivated or motivated by factors that are outside of ourselves, whether the situation that we're in or because somebody is forcing us or really, really wants us to do something. And we can see this in lots of language learners. We can see examples of these different kinds of motivation. So for intrinsic motivation, I know sometimes it doesn't feel like your students might be there because it's just a fun thing to do, but that's what intrinsic motivation is all about, that people find it gratifying to simply do the activity. So this person here, who's an English Canadian learner of German, said, I was hooked on German from the beginning. I learned how to count to 10 and that was all it took. I did about a month of browsing through some old textbooks, learned what the nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive definite articles were, and then started 101, which was intensely satisfying. I feel good and excited by it. So we all want students like that. I like this one, so I just wanted to show this. This is a Chinese Canadian learner of Japanese, and we categorize this intrinsic motivation to experience Japanese culture. I love it. I mean, heart, it's that captures it. There's nothing more to say. Now, of course, they don't all come that way. You have them at the other end of the extreme as well. And this is from an early study in California. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that one could become an astronaut in California. But I don't know why I'm learning Spanish. The school is making me. I don't know why. I'm a bio major and I want to be an astronaut. This isn't fair. I didn't like Spanish in high school and I don't like it now. If I wanted to learn another language, I would do it without tests, quizzes, and language labs. With every fiber of my being, I wish I didn't have to take this class. So pretty extreme reaction there. But then we can have what's this middle category here, extrinsic motivation. And what's interesting about DC and Ryan's theory, as I said, is that there's different types of extrinsic motivation, from things that are driven by factors outside of us completely to things that are completely regulated within ourselves. And I'll give you some examples so you can see that these are different than just doing it because you love it. Okay, so things that might be outside of us: get a job, general education requirements, mom wants me to. Okay, they're all things outside of the person. Introjected regulation is still a pressure or a reward, but we put it on ourselves. So this is a Korean learner of English. I want to speak English like a native speaker so that people back in Korea will recognize me and remember me as a person who speaks English really well. So there's some sort of ego involvement here. Okay, and I'm going to feel good about myself. This is important to me because it's going to pump my ego up a little bit, give me stature among my peers. I started taking German in my last year of high school because I felt bad about knowing only one language in a bilingual country. So there's this sense of guilt and pressure that you're putting on yourself. I'm not a good person, I'm not a good citizen if I don't speak another language. So that kind of sentiment is here. But these things have a lot of pressure or reward contingencies hanging on them. Over here, these are more governed by ourselves. So you may not really like learning the language, but it may help you get something that you think is important. So for instance, having worked as a graphic designer for 8 years, I'd like to try and find work in Germany in this field. And having language skills is a major benefit to doing that. So the language is going to help me achieve something that's important to me. I'm a politics student planning to continue graduate studies in political theory, and I'm interested in German 19th and 20th century political social theory, like Weber, Adorno, Habermas. And I feel some knowledge of the language may be useful to my studies. So this is going to help me, the language, he doesn't say here I love German, but it's going to help him with his studies. It's not uncommon for people to say, I want to be a really good teacher, and the students in my area speak another language. Perhaps in California it might be Spanish, or maybe in an environment where there's lots of English kids in Quebec, or French kids in Alberta. Learning to speak the language might help them reach their kids. So that's an example that comes up rather often. And then finally, when it's completely integrated into our sense of self, when it's a part where just doing the activity is an expression of who we think we are, that's called integrated regulation. And it's very close in feeling to intrinsic motivation. So I'm learning Chinese because my Chinese background is very important to me. Despite being very North Americanized or whitewashed, I think it is so important that I don't lose this part of myself, which is so fundamental and easy to lose as well. I suppose my reason then is because I want to. So it's coming from within, and it's a part of themselves. So that's a Chinese Canadian heritage language learner. Okay, and then just to re-emphasize then, I hope you can see that there's this continuum of because I love it and it's important to me, all the way down to I hate it and I'm forced to do this. But we can also group them as more controlled. And I'm going to be focusing on these, which I'll use the term autonomous or self-determined orientation. So I'm going to be focusing on these more self-oriented ones today. Okay, so just a couple of additional points. People can hold multiple reasons for language learning. I don't want to say that a person is this way or that way, because we often have different reasons for why we're doing things, especially in a university context. Students always have to have a grade. They always have to meet some course requirements. So that external regulator is always going to be there. But people can vary in how much they actually like doing the activity as well. So they might be, say they're intrinsically motivated as well. And this example here shows that this person is kind of across the board. I'm learning Chinese in order to prove to myself and my family that I'm capable of speaking, writing, and reading Chinese. Also, I believe that having Chinese as a second language can lead to better job opportunities. So this one might be more introjected, this one might be more external. If I go to China or Hong Kong, which I have plans to go there in a few years, it'll be very helpful to be able to communicate with other people. So traveling would be good. That helps with traveling. That might be more identified. Lastly, in general, I find learning languages to be fun and interesting. So there seems to be a mixture of everything in there. And I bring this point up because in the history of the field, especially with the integrative and the instrumental orientation, people always saw these things as categorically different orientations and not thinking about the fact that people can have both. And I really want to emphasize that. The other thing is that context matters, though. And in this particular, the slides are moving faster than I am. So if I'm trying to keep up to the slides. So if I'm speaking too fast, please let me know. It's that PowerPoint thing when they get on the timer when you don't intend it. Okay, so in this particular study, what we asked people to do, we had students come in who had a heritage language background, an ESL background, or a modern language background. And we just asked them to tell us why you're learning the language that you're learning. And people gave lots of different reasons and categorized those reasons according to the different kinds of motivation orientations that I showed you earlier, we included Gardner's integrative orientation. So that's wanting to learn a language because it helps you have connections with the second language community. And then we had some others that were sort of articulated, but they were pretty idiosyncratic. And we were able to categorize almost 80%, or 80%, just over, in the self-determination theory framework. So that's a good chunk of the reasons that people gave. But different groups emphasized different reasons. And I think what stands out most is if we look at the ESL people, these are ESL students at a university setting. They have to take English before they can take any university courses. And so this pressure to learn the language in order to advance to their university studies is very strong. It's very prominent. Okay. They have some identified reasons as well. I mean, they value it. It's their education. But that is really quite striking. The heritage language learners, on the other hand, where they stand out is in this integrated idea. So the idea that language is part of them. And then to a lesser extent, they express the integrative orientation where they say they want to have engagement with the target language community, but it's really about how important it is to them personally. And finally, the modern language students, well, you can see that yellow bar is distributed, you know, there's variations, but it's kind of flat. There's all sorts of different reasons. They have grades they've got to achieve. They can identify that this is an important thing for them to do. You know, it's important for their future career to do well in the language. And they're having the most fun of anybody. And then, of course, having contact. But it's kind of flatter and spread out across. Okay, so what I hope to show you then is that students' reasons can reflect greater or lesser self-determination. So what? Does it matter that they do? And that's where we'd want to look and see if they're related to outcomes. And basically, we have a really basic causal model here. What we're claiming is that orientations, the more self-determined you are in your orientation, the more engaged you'll be, and that's going to predict all sorts of wonderful kinds of outcomes, both in terms of your proficiency, your communicative competence, but also non-linguistic outcomes like maybe how much contact you have with the target language community, things like that. Your willingness to communicate with the target language community. And there's lots of correlational research that shows that this might be the case. So more autonomously oriented students tend to show greater intensity of effort and focus on the task. They show greater persistence in class and engagement in extracurricular activities that are related to language learning. They have more positive attitudes and less anxiety, greater success in language courses, and greater engagement with the target language community. It's all good news, but it's all correlational. So we really don't know which way this direction goes, and that's what I want to talk about with the research I'm going to show you. So the cross-sectional designs, we can't make causal claims, so we need a temporal aspect to see if a particular cause precedes an effect. And we want to, given this recent discussion about dynamic systems, an important principle in there is that causal directions are not just unidirectional, but they can be reciprocal. Things can have effects on each other. And so we want to look a little bit at this idea. So the analysis plan was to do a longitudinal study and then look at what happens with these variables across time using cross-leg panel analyses. And we used multivariate platform M+ to do this. And the basic idea is that we look at students across a course, a language course, and we measure them in the beginning in terms of their motivation, intrinsic motivation, and the intensity of their engagement, and then at about the midterm, and then at the end of the course. And you might expect that over time, like intrinsic motivation would predict intrinsic motivation at time 2, and that's intrinsic motivation at time 2 would predict it at time 3. People are probably pretty stable in their intrinsic motivation. And there's probably some stability in how, people who put in a lot of effort at the beginning are probably going to carry that through. So we want to be able to take that into account. And we also know that, or we expect that at any one given point in time, there's probably a correlation here, because we've already seen that in our correlational studies at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. So we want to take those correlations into account before we look at what might be happening over time. Okay, so if that causal model is correct, what we would expect is that the intrinsic motivation that you walk in at time 1 when you enter your language course, if you're really happy about it, you love the process, by the midterm we should be seeing you put in more effort, right? And that should continue. Oops. That should continue. Oh. Is it just going to take time? Yeah, and that should continue from time 2 to time 3. Okay, so that's the hypothesized direction. But we know that a correlation can go the other way as well. So it could be that you come in and you're all gung-ho at the beginning of the course and you put in a lot of effort and then you find you like it. And so over time, you just by virtue of the fact that you've really invested in it, you may start to like it, get a positive attitude towards it. And then the other possibility is that it's going both ways. So both things are affecting each other and they're reciprocal relations all the way through, or at some point there's a reciprocal relationship. So what might be going on? Well, in order to look at this question, we had 146 university students in lower level French courses fill out questionnaires. Early in the semester, so I think we started in September 8th, so by a week into the course they filled out a questionnaire. Then mid-semester, and then at the end of the semester, but before their final exam. And we started off with a nice number of students, and we lost half of them. We looked at various indicators of whether or not the data missing was random, and it does seem to be random. So we used estimators to replace the missing data. And the results don't differ whether we have the smaller sample or the larger sample, so pretty confident. At least with this sample, this is what's going on. And we had them fill out our language learning orientation scale, and you're likely familiar with these kinds of scales. We present an item, people have to indicate the amount they agree or disagree with the item, and we tap the different kinds of motivational orientations. So for the enjoyment I feel when learning French, I'm learning the language to gain the benefits, job, money, course credit that French will provide, because I would feel guilty if I didn't know the language, because it helps me achieve goals that are important to me, or because it is an important part of who I am. And then we had Garner's motivational intensity course item here, an example. I keep up to date with French by working on it almost every day, and people indicate their agreement or disagreement with that. And here's what we found. Okay, so not unexpectedly, if you come in intrinsically motivated, you're going to stay intrinsically motivated across the course. And if you come in putting in effort, you're going to stay putting in effort. It dips a little here, but you're going to stay putting in a lot of effort. We started off with a strong correlation there, but it got smaller. But what we did find is that intrinsic motivation at time 2 predicted greater intensity at time 3. And what was a bit of a surprise, though, so that was consistent with our hypothesis, but what was a surprise was that the more effort you put in at the beginning means you start to like learning the language more. And the same thing tended to happen here. I'm sorry, when I did the rehearsals, I did say don't save the timing. I'm sure I did, but it seems to have done that. I apologize for that. That's it. It's come back. He warned me about that my whole time I was a student. Okay, so what seems to be happening then is that by the time we get here, we're getting some reciprocal relationships going on here, where the more you like it means you're going to put in more effort. The more effort you put into it, the more you're going to like it. And so it kind of looks more like, rather than any kind of linear relationship, it kind of looks like a cycle or a spiral. You put in effort, you start to like it, you start to like it, you put in more effort, and it would be really interesting to follow this over time more. Unfortunately, the course ends. Okay, so we get this dynamic cycle here. So, so self-determined orientations and intensity are causally related, but not quite in the manner specified by the self-determination theory model. So that initially a motivational intensity predicts a self-determined orientation, but it becomes reciprocal in the later part of the course. And if we think about this from a dynamic systems theory perspective, we might start thinking about these reciprocal relations between variables, perhaps as interacting systems. That's what's going on with our effort and intensity, and what's going on with the reasons for why we are engaging in it in the first place are affecting each other. It might be seen as two different systems that are affecting each other. And the fact that the relationships are stronger in the later half of the course is interesting. When we first arrive in a course, it's hard to know, you might have had to take the course because, you're an art student and this is a language requirement. You have to do it, but you kind of like language anyway, so that's okay. It's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing, you just don't have much of an idea about it, you don't know who your teacher is, you don't know what your classroom dynamics are going to be like, but over time these things settle into place and then things start to become more predictable. And that's what an attractor state would be called in dynamic, complex dynamic systems theory. So that may be what's happening here when we start to see these relationships become stronger in the later half of the course. So, okay, so self-determination is important for this engagement. How can we get people more self-determined? Okay, and according to self-determination theory, they suggest that we have important needs as human beings. We have psychological needs, just like we have needs for thirst, hunger, to move around physically. Security is another thing that's talked about that's a little higher order. But we have needs to be autonomous, competent, and connected to other people. Okay, so what are those things? So to be more specific, autonomy refers to the idea that you're an agent of your own activity, that when you're engaged in things, you're doing it because you have chosen to do so, and it's important to you, not to anyone else, and that's a very motivating situation to be in. So we are making we have this feeling of making a conscious and voluntary decision to engage in a personally relevant activity. So this sense of choice is really important, but it's a meaningful choice, something that's important to us. It's great to have 100 flavors of ice cream, but it's not a particularly meaningful choice. It has to be important to you. Competence is the sense of being effective in performing the activity and being capable to rise to optimal challenges. That we thrive when we have the opportunity to master something. Not something that's so difficult that it's just going to overwhelm us, but just that smidgen more difficult that we're going to improve our competence by doing it. You can think about how this might align with Lantoff's discussions in sociocultural theory about scaffolding and L+1, that's compression. Yeah, but those kind of ideas about just setting the bar that much above your competence level. And then relatedness, the sense of secured and satisfying connections with others in one's social surroundings. Okay. Learning a language is risky business, and whenever we're trying something new and trying to master something new, it's good to know that you've got a bit of a safety net, that when we feel it's kind of attached to the other people around us, we're a little bit more willing to go out on a limb and be a little bit more creative. Okay, so here our causal account has gotten a little bit bigger. Here's what we looked at already. Then we have these self-perceptions of need fulfillment. We want to feel autonomy, competence, and relatedness in order to feel more self-determined and achieve all these wonderful results. So to support our sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, we need support from significant others. So we need people to help us feel like we're in control of our lives, to give us the kind of feedback that helps us develop our competence, and to feel involved, to act like they care about us, to act involved in our lives so that we feel a sense of connection with other people. And I'm going to talk today about the teacher. And this is just, I was hoping to find a nice positive quote, but I didn't find one that was quite as compelling as this one. But the teacher can have a pretty big impact, especially if there's no one else to support the language learner. So the main reason for me to be in Chinese class is so that I can finish my degree. When I signed up for this program, I was really excited about learning a new language and the culture that goes along with it. But I'm really disappointed in my teacher. She's very tunneled and inflexible in her teaching style. She's more concerned about the material to be covered than the well-being of her students, their comfort, and to develop the interest among them to motivate them for learning the language. I can't wait to be out of this class. My teacher makes me think twice about continuing my learning of Chinese language. So it's a pretty big impact on this person, this relationship with their teacher. And of course, people do say positive things about teachers. I do want to reassure you. They're just more articulate when they're feeling grumpy. So some early research, we looked at this, and we did find some support for this idea that a more intrinsic and self-determined motivation is likely to come about when the learner has a sense of autonomy and a sense of competence. And we also asked, back in this early study, we asked for the learners to tell us what they thought about their teachers. And we had 4 dimensions here. Do you think your teacher is controlling you and telling you what to do and kind of forcing you to do things her way? Is the teacher just grumpy and doesn't seem to want to be around you? Because you have controlling people who are actually nice, although these tend to be correlated. We probably all know nice, controlling people. Teacher congeniality, like telling jokes and all that, friendly, approachable sort of thing. And then teacher informative feedback. Are they giving you feedback that really helps you improve your competence? So they might give you an A, but do they elaborate on why you got that A? And even with an A, there's always room for improvement. Do they tell you that so that you can improve? And what we found was that the more teacher was seen as controlling, the less learners felt that they were autonomous. And finally, that arrow's popped up. The more the teacher was seen as giving informative feedback, the more the learner's sense of competence increased, and they felt more intrinsically motivated. This negativity and congeniality didn't have anything to do with these 2 need fulfillments, these 2 psychological needs. Now, in this study, we didn't look at relatedness, and maybe these things are important for establishing that sense of connection with other people. But given what we looked at here, it's not so much whether they're a nice person, a grumpy person, or an approachable person. It's the control and informative feedback that helps. Okay, but again, that was correlational, so let's look at it over time. So if we have an autonomy supportive teacher, you should feel the opposite of autonomy. The more a teacher is autonomy supportive, the less controlled you should feel. The less controlled you should feel, the more intrinsic motivation you should have. Okay. And we would expect the autonomy supportive teacher at time 2 predicts feeling less controlled at time 3, and similarly like this. Okay, so over time, that's the kind of causal direction we'd expect. And of course, it didn't turn out exactly like that. In this, so we're looking at whether need fulfillment predicts self-determined orientations. So feelings of being controlled will predict lower levels of intrinsic motivation over time. And then we wanted to look at this reciprocal relationship again. Is there a dialectical relation between the student and their social world? The more students perceive their teacher to be autonomy supportive, the less they will report feeling controlled in language learning. So we had 141 university students registered in diverse language courses. So at the U of A, we have lots of different kinds of courses: French, Japanese, German, ASL, Ukrainian, Latin, Cree, and 10 other courses. It's a typical university sample. There's not much else to say here, mostly mother tongue English. And they filled out our language learning orientation scale. They indicated how much they felt controlled in their language class. Like, in my language class, I feel obligated to do things in a particular way. And then they told us what they thought of their teacher. And my language instructor provides me with choices and options. So that would be supporting their own personal choice. And then we looked to see how they related over time. Again, looking early in the semester, mid-semester, and at the end of the semester. In this case, we started with 417 and dropped to around 140 later on. And again, it seemed to be a random attrition rate, so that's good. It's a sad thing, but it's good. And here's what we found. And here you'll notice that the orange arrows go in the wrong direction. So the more intrinsically motivated people started off, the less controlled they felt. So if they came in really loving the language, they were likely to see the language class as being less controlling over time. And that was consistent across the course. So now what happens if we put the teacher in there? It gets even more complicated. And what we see is that more is happening over here. We've got more arrows, well, not more arrows, but we've got crisscrosses going on here. But essentially what we're seeing is that if students come in feeling intrinsically motivated, they're really doing it because they love it. Then they see their teachers being more autonomy supportive. And they're likely, if they come in feeling controlled, they'll see their teacher as feeling less autonomy supportive. So maybe they feel like they have to take this course, and later on they blame it on their teacher. Might be one interpretation. But what's interesting over here, feeling controlled leads to seeing the teacher as less autonomy supportive. But the more you perceive the teacher as being autonomy supportive, the less you feel controlled. Okay, so that is going in the direction that self-determination theory would expect that it would. And there's this reciprocal relationship again between what students perceive their teacher to be like and how they're feeling personally, which is quite interesting. And then, so again, autonomy support, feelings of control, and intrinsic motivation hang together, but not quite in the causal manner described by SDT. Self-determined orientation negatively predicts feelings of being controlled. And there is evidence of this possible dialectical or transactional relationship between students and teachers. Students' self-perceived orientations and feeling of autonomy predict their perceived teacher autonomy support, and the perceived teacher autonomy support predicts students' feelings of being less controlled or being less autonomous. Okay, so it does look like what the students are doing might be affecting what the teachers are doing. Again, the reciprocal relations are evident in the later part of the course. Again, that might be related to having the course sort of settle into a sort of attractor state. I want to emphasize the importance of the social context, in this case the teacher, and this possibility of interacting systems, what the teacher is doing and what the student is doing, if we think about them as being two separate systems. But the most important finding is that self-determined orientations and intensities are causally related, and it's not intensity in this case, but being controlled and autonomy support are causally related, but not quite the same manner specified by the SDT model. And so I think this idea about a dynamic complex system is particularly helpful here, rather than trying to think about these variables as being related in some sort of a chain of events, a billiard ball effect. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about was teachers. And this is a recent study that we did with teachers at the Ontario Teachers of English as a Second Language. So if any of you are part of that organization, you might have participated in this study. But what I want to point out here is that as teachers, we are likewise best motivated when we experience self-determination. And I'm just going to give you an overview of some of the preliminary results from this study. So in case you want to know how other teachers are motivated, what you will see here is that teachers seem to report being spread across the board here. So their teachers, there's quite a few teachers, so this is starting at 3. This is pretty close to the midpoint here. Teachers have a little bit more A motivation, but than I would have expected, at least compared to the students. The students don't usually report A motivation as high. They have external reasons, pressures, job, maybe they need to have a job, money, that sort of thing. They feel a certain personal obligation to do it. But it's a little bit higher down here. Some people seem to be saying that they're having fun. It's an important part of who they are. It helps them achieve valued goals. Okay, but I thought it was quite interesting that it's a rather flat. All sorts of things going into teachers' experience. But what helps them to have more self-determined work orientations are associated with, well, the more they have a self-determined work orientation, the more they report greater absorption, dedication, and energy in teaching, and the more they intend to continue with the job. So having a self-determined orientation is helpful for engagement in the job and continuing the job. And if people don't feel that way, they don't. Which is the, the more controlled they feel, it's unrelated to absorption, dedication, and energy in teaching and intention to continue the job, quit the job. And this is something that comes up often. And in the research that we've been looking at, both with the students and now here with the teachers, there's no necessary relationship between feeling controlled and whether or not you continue in the job or engage in the job. And I think why that happens is that when the carrot is there or the stick is there, we do it. And when you take it away, we stop. And so it really depends on whether or not the carrot and stick are salient in your mind. And so we're not going to see a high correlation here. It's just not, to use the carrot and the stick is just not a reliable motivator. And that might make sense, you know, if you think about working with your own students. I think about it in terms of parenting. It's never paid off for me to pay my kids to clean their room or, you know, even taking away their video games or what have you, because that just changes things in the moment. It doesn't change things over the long term. And then if there's a motivation, if they just don't have a reason to be there, they can't see the point of it, then there is less absorption, dedication, and energy in teaching, and a greater intention to quit the job. I have no reason. I don't care about the money. I don't care about, my ego's not invested in this. I don't see any important reason for doing this. Not a part of me. I quit. So what supports teachers' motivation? Well, we looked at 2 things. And the supervisors, the immediate supervisor, we asked about that. And intrinsic motivation was supported when the supervisor was seen as being involved or warm. So people enjoyed it more if they had a good relationship with their supervisor, a positive, connected sense of connectedness. Now, student engagement we used as a predictor variable. It could also be an outcome variable. I realize that, it's correlational data. But the more intrinsic motivation the teachers reported, the more likely they were to see their students as being engaged. So if your students seem to like being there and are engaged in what they're doing, maybe you feel more intrinsic motivation. It's more fun to be a teacher. Okay. But I can certainly see that going the other way. The more you like being a teacher, the more your students might be engaged. Autonomous extrinsic motivation was related to the supervisor's warmth and involvement, but also their autonomy support. So the more you're going to take this on as being personal, a part of who you are, and an important thing for you to do, depended on the teacher providing that, or the supervisor providing that warm, secure environment, but also allowing you to do your own thing and internalize it. Although that was a little bit lower, that was a marginal effect. And again, the student engagement was important too. And finally, feeling controlled was negatively related to supervisors' perceived autonomy support. The more controlling the supervisor was seen, the more you would feel more like you were doing it because someone was controlling you. And student engagement. If you felt the students weren't engaged, you were likely to feel like you had to be there. And then amotivation here had to do with really not liking, thinking the students were disengaged, didn't care, and people just said, I don't want to be here. I don't have a reason to be here. So it does suggest that self-determination theory might not only be helpful in understanding how our students feel, but also help us to know how we feel. And if we feel like we're intrinsically motivated or autonomously motivated, we may have more engaged students. It can pay off in the long run to have more engaged students because it not only helps the students, it might help us. So that might be one argument for a very personal argument for putting some effort into trying to create this environment for your students because it may be beneficial to the teacher. Okay, well, I thought I'd just finish with a couple of suggestions for how to foster autonomy, competence, and relatedness. This work a lot of this work is from John Marshall Reeves, who's done a lot of research on self-determination theory in the education context more generally. But I think just to keep in mind that the more we foster relevance for our students by maybe adopting their frame of reference during instruction and providing explanatory rationales for why we're doing the things that we're doing, it helps students to understand why it's relevant to what we're doing. Recognizing the student's natural pace is important. So that's like adopting the student's frame of reference and not intruding with it or interfering with it. And of course, that's kind of hard because we do have timelines that we have to meet. But as long as you can think of the extreme situation where there's somebody who's always jumping in when the student can't find the word, jumping in there and helping them, but not letting the student take the time they need to find that word that they need, for example. And then offering choices. There was a lot of emphasis in the early part of the theory on this offering of choices. But like I said, we're getting a better understanding that some choice is nice, but it has to be relevant choice. And some work by Olga Baldwin and Nakata in Japan suggests that this issue of autonomy may be less salient. It may be important, but not as salient in some cultural contexts. So working in Japan, students don't talk a lot about autonomy. They assume, and maybe students in North America too, to some extent, maybe all of us, that when we hire a teacher, when there's a teacher, they're the expert. They should be telling us what to do because that's their job. So people might hand over, it may be an autonomous decision to hand over the autonomy to someone else because they're the expert and they're going to look out for you. And there's some research that's looked at examples in coaching, in sports, where Olympic athletes will say, I just put myself in the hands of my coach and I let them tell me what needs to be done. Now, of course, they're not completely a doll, but it's this idea that you personally have chosen that this is the way that you're going to engage in this situation. So that choice is a little more complex. And I think it's interesting that research is being done in different cultural contexts. Fostering a sense of connectedness, expressions of interest and empathy, assurances of security and positive regards, and creating, Yang et al. Did a recent study from a Cal perspective. So they were looking at students who developed a sort of students in a distance language class who developed a Facebook type page. It was a different platform, but it was the same idea that you could make posts and comment on other people's posts. And initially what she found, people had to get this set up and get it going. But over time, people developed a sense of, they got to know each other and they started to feel comfortable around each other. And she noticed that the way people were interacting with each other and how they were using the language was changing. She also noticed that the students started to become more autonomous. And in the beginning, she always had to prompt the students to get them to do stuff. But after they got that going over time, they started to do it themselves. So they were becoming more autonomous as a group. So they were creating this community of inquiry where she was now more facilitating their conversation among each other rather than guiding it, which might have been important in the beginning to help set the structure, which would help them to feel competent about using the platform, but then let them take it over from there. So I think that's a really interesting article about an actual application in the language class or language context. And then finally, fostering competence. Informational feedback and structure is really important. How are you going to help people to know what they've done right, what they've done wrong, and what they can do to do better? So setting clear goals and plans of actions, articulate clear, explicit, and well-organized directions, and constructive feedback with little off-task or, the case of the grade with no comments, little feedback, or competence irrelevant info. So making sure all feedback is constructive there. I don't have time to talk about this here, but one direction that we are going is fostering people's sense of competence, is giving them capacity to develop their own competence and to see themselves as being relatively competent language learners. We've started to look at another angle here, thinking about what people actually think about competence. Is it changeable or isn't it changeable? And in the language learning context, this would seem to be a common, it's not uncommon, at least I've heard lots of people say, oh, I just don't have that language thing. I haven't got an ear for language. I haven't got the knack for it. Sometimes it seems to me that it's an Anglophone thing. I just can't seem to learn French. I don't know. And these kinds of beliefs about the nature of competence can be really important as well. Not just how much have you got, but can you actually change it? And we're starting to have a look at people who have an entity belief, who believe it's not changeable. It's essential characteristics that somebody's had. And people who have a more incremental mindset, that you can grow your competence. And that would seem to be another part of the equation. It's not just improving people's sense that they're competent, but the idea that it's changeable and it can be developed. And so I'll just come back to the main points. I've tried to argue today that students' reasons or orientations reflect greater or lesser self-determination, that more self-determination is related to more successful outcomes, and that we can promote self-determination by supporting students' feelings of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And that we benefit from that, perhaps, as teachers, and that we're likewise best motivated when we experience self-determination. And I have a host of people to thank here before I end for questions and discussion. Students who've been involved in this, including Nigel Mentalou, Kristen Marchak, Christy Somer, Maya Sujita McEwen, and Deuma Vargas Lascano. Many teachers, and as I mentioned, the TESOL Ontario people, people who helped us with our web design, and of course Shirk. And I'll just leave it there and open the floor for discussion. So thank you for listening. Yeah.
So I'd like to ask, always ask me questions because I don't feel qualified necessarily to comment. But one thing that I was thinking and taking notes on my phone, wasn't texting during your presentation, was I was wondering. I was quite curious about the self-determination and the continuum that you showed, and And sometimes you kind of answered my questions as I had them in my head. You answered them on the following slide immediately. But one of the questions that I was wondering about was, so for the different, so you showed us how there was sometimes overlapping these different categories on the continuum. Sometimes would be overlapping, or sometimes could be potentially a combination of more than one, right?
Mhm.
And then I was also wondering if mm, if in any way these could be related to personality types. So something, I don't know, like along the
Myers-Briggs.
Myers-Briggs categories. So I'm wondering if there's certain types of people who are more likely to kind of feel the duty to learn the language because it's part of their culture and part of their
Right.
history. And there's more people, I don't know, who are more outgoing and saying, I'm just going to go for the fun of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's something
Yeah.
possible to control for necessarily, but I'm just wondering if there's been any kind of work done relating them.
I don't know because I haven't, it hasn't been a main interest of mine. I don't know. I imagine that there's work on how different motivational subtypes might relate to different personality variables, whether it's the Myers-Briggs or the Big Five or what have you. I'm just not familiar with that literature, but I can't imagine it's been overlooked. So I can't answer that question. DC and Ryan would argue that that people can have general causality orientations, so just an overall chronic way of the way they look at the world that you could measure, and then in each specific life domain or even in a situational moment, you could adopt a different orientation. So you might feel very intrinsically motivated as a skier, but not as a bowler or something like that. So you could have different sports domains or something like that. But you could, but this idea that there could be general orientations as well. Yes, they do talk about that sort of a chronic. This is the way I orient myself to the world. The other question about culture maybe speaks a bit to that. That maybe part of those orientations might not be sort of a biological thing, but might be something that's something that comes to us depending on the culture that we're raised in. And what the research, so there's a couple of things that are going on with regards to culture and self-determination theory. And on one level, Valery Cherkov and DC and Ryan have looked at, compared Russia to North America. And what they found in Russia is that people feel relatively externally controlled. So when you look at mean levels, people are saying, we're really controlled, you know, we've got to do these things because it's the system. Intrinsic motivations, you know, kind of down. Maybe in the academic domain, you know, this isn't a lot of fun. As compared to North America, where people might be a little higher, doing things because they want to, not because they have to. But when you look at the correlations between autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and these kinds of orientations and the kinds of outcomes, those patterns still hold. So the mean levels may differ because there may be more pressures in one sociocultural context than in another. But the fact that autonomy, or the idea that autonomy, a greater sense of autonomy, predicts more intrinsic motivation, which predicts more engagement, is still there. So that's what their research shows. Other research shows us, though, has sort of looked at, okay, well, that's all well and good, but you know, if it's kind of going to that idea, if your mom tells you to do something, is that feeling controlled or feeling like that she cares? And so research looking at kids by Lepper and Igenyar, a long time ago actually, found that if the experimenter suggested a child do something, or if their mom suggested that they do something, the kids were much less intrinsically motivated than if they decided to do it themselves. But in Japan, or no, it was the Chinese Americans, if the experimenter told them to do it, they were much less intrinsically motivated. But if their mom suggested they do it, than they were intrinsically motivated, and even a little bit more so than when they did it themselves. So it sort of raised the idea of maybe relatedness is important here, or maybe it's this idea of giving up, of choosing to hand your what's going over, or I guess not giving up your autonomy, but giving up being in charge of what's going to happen to somebody who has your well-being at heart and knows what they're doing. So people have been looking into that a little bit more. Also, the idea that introjection is somehow a pressure. Well, for a lot of people, it's really important to them to hold up the norms of their society. They see it as an important part of themselves to behave in the appropriate way in their particular society. So Joan Miller and her colleagues looking in India have found that that feeling of introjection, of putting a pressure, feeling obligated to do something, is actually related to this feeling of that it's an important part of who I am, and it's not seen negatively. It's not associated with the same negative things that it is in North America when you feel an obligation to do something. That's perceived as something negative. So people are starting to delve into what might be the cultural differences here. And then, of course, when we start seeing cultural differences, even within a culture, there's all sorts of different experiences that people have and value. You know, those kinds of things that we see cross-culturally are probably also happening intraculturally as well. So does that sort of answer? Yeah. Oh, yeah, fine. Oh.
Much. I just want to say, first of all, I really appreciated a lot of what you said. In our academic mission at Ottawa U, it used to say, students are at the heart of our academic mission. And that is exactly what you talked about. You know, every time I spend hours, or we spend hours giving informational feedback, and people say, why are you doing this? Nobody cares. Yeah. Somebody cares. Yeah. And some of them do care, but it is nice to know that it pays off, at least in your research. Yeah. But I wondered, I have one question. You know, you said self-determination affects successful outcomes. I grew up in an immigrant community where everybody spoke 3 languages starting out, so we weren't, you know, unilingual. Yeah. But even within that, you could see people who were who came later and who spoke. And I've seen it among my students. I see it in my own family. Some people are better language learners. And I don't care whether people say that's not a fact. I mean, we see it. And somehow, you know, when I start learning something and it works, like this kid who read a German book and learned the accusative and the dative. Yeah. You know, like not everybody does that. Yeah. Anyway, I just wondered if there is some research also that when you're successful, yes, your teacher helps, yes, the circumstances help, but when you're successful, you don't care, as long as the teacher lets you move on. Yeah. You know, is there, I mean, is that part of it? You said it's systems interacting, and of course. Right, and I'm trying to think, there's some people like Maya Sujita McCowan who's looked at learners at different levels and like different levels of competence to see what matters. And I'm thinking of the one study that actually Richard mentioned, where she looked at higher level students, and they were mostly interested in getting information from their teachers about the culture. So they didn't need anymore some of these other, this isn't really answering your question, but there were differences between the lower level students and the higher level students. The lower level students wanted more of that informative feedback because their job was to improve their competence. The higher level students probably had a fairly high level of competence. Now they wanted to be able to go out and use it. And so they were asking for, well, we were pairing up the cultural information with the integrative orientation. So they were more interested in their teacher telling them about the culture. So that's one way in which they're different. Yeah, I just wondered, you know, we know that in our classes, what you do sometimes doesn't make any difference. Some of them, I mean, it does. It makes a big difference. So kind of, is that kind of an aptitude question that some people would have an aptitude? Because you know, when you're good at music, you'll like your piano lessons because you improve, you see the improvement. But you also need the mother who, you know, makes you practice 2 hours a day. And it's really a pity, like Gardner, when he first started talking about motivation, always said, well, there's aptitude, and that's over here. And I'm going to talk about motivation. And, you know, then aptitude always got left off, and, you know, somebody would measure it and say, oh, yeah, and there's aptitude.
and they're two separate things. That last bit that I introduced about the mindsets and the idea that you can grow your competence, like this idea that there's a given aptitude and it's fixed versus an aptitude and it's changeable. I think we're starting off on this line, and one of the things I'd love to do is to see how that interacts with measures of aptitude, like, you know, do they relate to each other at all? We don't do enough looking at aptitude and motivation together. They've really developed as separate areas of research.
But the rest of that still is fascinating, valuable.
It's an interesting question, because that idea that we don't have an ear, you know, that people would say that. I'm pretty sure one of my sons does not have an ear for languages. But where do we go with that? Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, for sure. Oh no, always the hardest question.
Oh,
Like,
yes.
there you go.
Okay. I know you said you did not want to talk about it, but I'm going to ask a question about identity and the relationship between the processes that you described and the development of identity, particularly this issue of a hybrid identity emerging with the language learner progressing. Do you see any relationship between that type of process, which you know has been documented as well, and self-determination?
Okay. I haven't looked at. I'm trying to think if we've ever collected data on that. Probably.
No, just theorize.
But okay, so I'm going to theorize. Well, actually, I don't need to theorize, because we have measured situated identity. And so, in fact, in one of these studies, in the French study, we measured people's feelings of ethnic identification to the Francophone and Anglophone groups, and looking just at their Francophone identity in the school context. So, you know, when I'm in school, I feel more or less Francophone. And what we've found is that we've done structural equation models at the third time point, so at the end of the course. And what we found is that the more autonomy support people have, the more they feel autonomy, the more integrated and intrinsically motivated they'll feel, and the higher they will say their Francophone identity is. So, which is this idea of internalize. So the question here is, when we internalize the language and it becomes a part of ourselves, do we also start to feel like we're a member of that target group? Now, of course, that's not the same thing as being a bicultural or a hybrid, but it's kind of speaking to that question. So, yes, I'm a person who speaks French. Do I feel Francophone? And they do tend to say, at least in the school context, that they do. Now, whether that generalizes out, it doesn't seem to generalize outside of the school context. It might have been a better measure to look at a hybrid identity. That might be more where they go. But it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and it seems to me, and I have no data on that either for the time being, although I'm trying. Is it the issue of, is it identity switching as a function of the situation, or is it the development of a melting pot, a hybridized identity, a blended identity, call it what you want?
Right.
And does the motivational orientation influence that outcome?
That's a good question.
But,
I mean, I think that, you know, this, for many people, the school context is where they have their exposure to that other culture. So it seemed to me that it would start, any identity change would start in that particular domain. But what that looks like in terms of, are they blending it, or does it depend on whether they're talking to their classmates versus their teacher, or
maybe the blending occurs later when it really becomes the other language really becomes integrated in itself.
Yeah.
But that's a hypothesis.
We actually did a study in 2000s, looking at French immersion students, comparing the students at Campus Saint-Jean. We have a Francophone campus at Alberta and an Anglophone campus, and immersion students who went to the Francophone campus were more integrated in their orientation and reported higher French identity in the school domain, but I think also across the other domains as well. So that might speak to it too, but I haven't looked at that in a long time. It's a good question. Oh, I got to say to Richard that it's a good question.
For once, usually I'm telling you, don't ask me that question, it's too hard.
I think somebody else had their hand up, but I realized that I don't know what time we
If I may. I found it also to be very interesting. And this will be another one where I'll ask you to theorize maybe because it's, but I'm interested in the role that technology and these new sort of digital spaces are creating for the students. And one of the things that often comes up is the ability when they're well designed to potentially customize more and therefore maybe give a little bit more autonomy to the student in terms of the rate at which things happen, whether or not that slide will move. And I'm wondering if you're aware of people sort of taking that theory and looking at how maybe these new environments may be increasing autonomy for the students and therefore the outcome.
Yeah. On Tuesday, I was at a talk, and it was somebody that was preparing for AAAL. He was using, I didn't know this theorist, Fogg, F-O-G-U-E, and he has a book called Persuasive Technology or something like that. And it sounded to me like it was a kind of intrinsic motivation model. But I, from the way it was described, I thought maybe it wasn't as grounded in the psychological research as perhaps it should be. But what this person was talking about was the idea that there were 3 dimensions to, like these 3 fundamental needs, or they had different needs listed, and was making the argument that persuasive technologies could address each of these needs. So if I were to take it and put it into self-determination theory, I think as if you designed a computer-assisted language learning program of some kind, if it helped with autonomy, so you go at your own pace, that would be important. You make your own choices. You decide when you're going to go. As much as possible, you may have to take this course. You have to take this course, but you do have that autonomy built in. You can. The developing competence. I had to do a course like this when I learned German, and to me, it was amazing how quickly you could develop competence because you got instant feedback on everything that you did. As soon as I would say something into the microphone, you'd get back the way, you copy someone and then it would come back and you'd go, oh, that wasn't at all like that. So that competence feedback could be really helpful. And then the sense of relatedness, I think, is the question, that we worry about with technology is that it always appears on the surface to be a rather isolating thing when you're sitting just in front of a computer terminal. But if you can do like the Facebook thing or have the chat rooms, or I kind of laugh at this because when my kids are playing video games and they have their friends over, they're all hanging over each other to all look on the same computer screen, somehow getting everybody in the same room together, just making sure that those 3 needs are met. And I think it could be really effective. Yeah, that's what I think. That's what I hypothesize. And that's what this person who's presenting at AAAL is interested in. So I think there's research coming. I'd have to look it up. I would have to look it up. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. It's really an honor to come back to Ottawa and talk with everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I'm on the wrong side of the table. Maybe Jeremy says,
That's very good.
Oh, we have not. Yes, we need an attendance list. We need an attendance list. Okay, so I have a scrap of paper. We'll use this. Please sign your name. This is part of the school.
Yeah, I will.
Yeah, so just say your name on there, and then our Connectedness person will be very happy. We need
Just
to,
came in. Okay, I hadn't met her.
Hey,
Yes.
Yes. I'm probably even have it on my computer.
thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yes. Nice. Oh, I know what that is. I hope you like it. Yeah, yeah. Good idea. Oh, yeah. You're very anything you liked it. Oh, yeah.
If we go to the split screen at this point, you might see a thank you from our. Blue.
Yes. So finally they went blue. The longest time the marketing agent was buying everything in lime green, and I detest that color. Yeah. Yeah. Next. That's the next one. The next one.
Actually, my high school was green and gold.
You forget your.